earth, fire, wind, and water. Those are the elements that have to come together in order to blacksmith. Now the term blacksmith comes from black, the metal that they use, and smith or smythe to strike. These middle-aged magicians would have had to been inventors of all sorts of tools that would have helped the people of that time, like they're doing here. So you're gonna need a fuel source. Now in the old days, they used to burn coal, but they've switched over to this coke, which is burns cleaner and fewer impurities. And there you have it, creation. Some say mankind were created with the same elements, and we have a soul. Why can't this? What is the soul of steel, and does it exist today? We will uncover the truth by examining two modern blacksmiths who have different methods and ideology, but both imbue their craft with life. Now this first blacksmith has an artistic way of looking at his art, and I'm gonna try my hand at this craft. Big Sky Country, the Alberta Plains. One road coming, one road going. Isolated. But this sleepy town has a secret.
My name is Craig Palmer. I am part owner of Old World Welding and Forge with my wife Christine, and we reside in the town of Standard. I've been doing blacksmithing and welding now for about 14 years, and every year now is been busier and busier. There is a big difference. A lot of people get the two mixed up. They think if you're a blacksmith, you're just a welder. With blacksmithing, there's a lot of old types of traditional methods. Welding has changed as far as equipment, but what we do is we combine those two together, being a modern blacksmith. I'm a fanatic of a lot of the medieval time era and castles, and I figured, well, it's an old era, so I figured the old world, but then people need to know that also, you know, I do welding, custom fabrication. So I came up with Old World Welding, and it kind of resembles the old times and the new. Every blacksmith has his own style, his own technique, and his own taste. And customers tend to lean towards those that they're in favor of. And some of them are organic, some of them will be more, more alien. In regards to ours, it's a lot of items that my wife has suggested, and then from there I've elaborated on a lot of the techniques, the styles, a lot of the shapes, and then even textures. And we found that, you know, if a person's looking at an item 20 feet away, you get one vision of it, but once you start walking closer and you start seeing the veins in the leaves, and you start seeing the texture onto like a wood grain onto the branches, we'll take that even further, so that you can have a 3D format instead of just something that'll mount to the wall. We love to fish when we do have a waking moment. We came up with something that kids would probably like, you know, and we came up with this design, and we worked at it, and we weren't happy with it. So what it ended up being was, we started growing more. We said it needs to have something more on the back. It needs to be more vicious looking. It needs to be more spiny. And then we started growing from there. And even when it comes to what supports the fish and what the fish will be sitting on, it's got to have some type of vision. If you just put it on just a straight flat stand, people are going to say, well, it's okay. But if every item has some detail to it, and then you really mold it all together, then you're going to have one nice piece of work of art. It's not going to be just the one piece on the top and a plain bottom. It's going to be the whole unique piece. We've made a normal piece of round bar into vines, trees, and we've put the texture into it. Different techniques on how to hold the hammer, different types of hammers, and then the hammers, you know, it becomes second nature, and you tend to want to continue because you might come up with something different just with a different few strokes. Basically, if I was to create an art piece, first you have to start off with design. Well, into bamboo, it's another traditional blacksmith technique. You have to first start off with a tool, which is called a guillotine. And a lot of blacksmiths use it, and you can't buy this tool the way that most people can go to a hardware store. You can either buy it from a blacksmith shop or it has to be custom made by yourself. I mean, with myself, it took hours to build it, and the first one didn't turn out, so you had to build a second one. And the biggest thing with it is the dies. And then also, when you shape the dies, that is your key element to how the bamboo is made. And then also, if you use the wrong steel to make the dies, and then if you use the wrong curvature, you're starting all over again. So there's a lot of detail that goes into it until the finished product. It's just like any one of our products that need blacksmith tools. All of these tools have to be made, and they have to be sometimes made 2 or 3 times before they're perfect. And this is what goes into a lot of this. It's not like welding a piece of steel together where you just have to square it and make sure that it doesn't warp on you. When you're building items that are from nature or somebody's work of art, there's a lot of detail that goes into the tooling that has to make these items so that the customer is totally happy and says, that's exactly what I want. You know, there's a wealth of information out there on blacksmithing. The art is actually getting stronger instead of weaker, because that's one thing that is shared amongst blacksmiths is knowledge. And they never keep it to themselves. It's always widespread.
True to his word, Craig takes some time to teach me the basics.
You want to try and get rid of any mill scale that's on the anvil, because if you work it back into your metal, sometimes it can create problems. So now what you do is you basically, that's one side, but because you have a good anvil, it's flattened on both sides. So now, there's your four-sided point. Now we're going to make that into a little more pointy. The other 4 sides, you want to hammer those down, and then you want to rotate so that it's an even point. It gets a little more refined, and you just need small taps.
It looks pretty easy though. It's so hard.
It is. It is.
How'd that come out?
Good. What you have to do is you just got to taper your hammer down a little bit so that you're tapering it down. Move it towards the edge like this, and I'm kind of going off like that a little bit. But that comes. Yep. And you can hit several times on one side if it's uneven. There you go. So now we're going to work a little faster so we don't lose this heat. So now what I'm going to get you to do is I'm going to get you to take that over to the quenching tub, and we're going to cool it off. If you don't have a passion, and that could be for anything, you're not going to succeed. Because the more passion you have, the more creative you get and the deeper you want to dig into the subject and the better you want to make yourself. So then that reflects on all of your pieces and your talent. And it comes over time.
Well, it was a lot more difficult than I thought it was going to be. It's no walk in the park, and everything you do is with giant tools. So I got a lot to learn.
We continue to work like the stories of old Viking lore. Thor and his hammer mock us, but there's always tomorrow.
Well, that's a modern way to use an ancient art to create some pretty unique pieces. Our next blacksmith has a different outlook on how to create, and you'll see why.
In terms of technology and the pace that mankind has set for ourselves, these tools would seem prehistoric. Vancouver Island, a relaxing locale that fosters a laid-back lifestyle. Perhaps even a mindset that is displaced from time. On a nondescript farmhouse, an artist has fully embraced this ideology.
My name is Dave and I'm a blacksmith knife maker. I work out of Crossheart Forge on Vancouver Island. When I was 14, I started knife making. I was living in Calgary at the time and we did a unit in school on Japan, and I was really intrigued by the samurai lifestyle and the ethic, and especially by the metalwork and the incredible work that goes into a Japanese sword. Yeah, not everybody needs a Japanese sword in the forest on Vancouver Island, although some people do. But what I've been doing is using the Japanese tanto as the foundation for my work. When I started making knives, I was a teenager or young teenager, so there was no cash to put into the project. So I started by working with scrap metal from my grandparents' farm. But as I did that, I realized that for me, part of the story of a finished work is where it came from and what the steel was in its former life. So as I realized how important that was to me, I've actually come to a place where I don't buy any metal or any wood or any steel for any of my projects, because there's so much out there that's just rusting away, some piece of farm equipment or some scrap wood that's coming from some other local process. And to me, if I can put that stuff to work, those little pieces that no one else can really use, that's one more element of story to my work, as well as kind of closing a loop of not, wasting or buying stuff we don't need to. So my process, once I've found a piece of steel that looks like it might work, is I'll first test a little piece of it and see if it will harden. That tells me if there's enough carbon in it to make a knife. So I'll forge it out thin and heat it up and quench it in water. And if it snaps when I hit it with a heavy hammer, then I know that it's got enough carbon. And where it breaks, I can look at the grain of the steel and see how the quality is.
Not too hard. You never hit an anvil without a steel in between hard, or you'll dent the anvil, or your hammer. Hopefully your hammer.
Working the steel in this fashion is hard and laborious. The metal remains solid, and each stroke does little to change that.
Like a power hammer. So at that point, then I can take a piece of it and begin to forge it out, but it's all done by hand with the hand hammer. And there's kind of two stages. First, to forge it into the tsunobe form, which is a rectangular blank, which sort of distributes the amount of steel for the blade and the tang and sort of determines the dimensions. And then after that, forge it into the shape of the blade. When we moved back from Japan 4 years ago, I kind of started with the question, how did they make knives 100 years ago or 500 years ago? And is it possible for me to do that? And so it started just simply with, well, can I do all the work by hand hammering instead of using a power hammer? Or can I use a pine sap resin instead of epoxy glue? How many of the modern things can I replace? But it kind of led to further and further until the point where I realized I don't have to use a grinder or a sander if I learn to forge well, and then I can do all my finishing by hand filing.
I'm working at the edge here so that I don't put the corner of the hammer into the anvil, because it's kind of wedge shaped. And as I work this edge down, this thing wants to become a banana and curve up. So I'm always fighting that by resetting it, straightening it.
And to the point where now I'm basically off the grid in my shop, and I can say pretty much from start to finish, I'm doing 13th century knife making using 13th century techniques and materials. So I don't use any propane, I don't use any mineral coal. We make all our own charcoal. Everything that would have been done 500 years ago, 700 years ago is the way I do it. So hand files, hand saw, hand hammering, polishing stones, no epoxy, all the stuff that we take for granted. It's possible to live without, but it's a lot more work. I think it's tempting as a maker to try and quickly get through a lot of work, but my wife has always reminded me, if you're gonna make something, make it the best that you possibly can at this point. Don't make something that will sell, just good enough to sell, but make something that should be in a museum. And so, I don't know, but there is the potential that someday my work will end up in a museum because real materials last if they're taken care of. Somebody lifetimes from now could still be using one of my knives or could still be caring for it. So my goal now is to make things that almost look as if they should be in a museum, both because they're well finished, but also because of all the materials and the techniques that I use are historical.
Fine slivers of discarded material fall away to reveal the true nature of the steel. Scraping the steel gives me a glimpse into the scope of dedication you need for this type of work.
Like, I know it's metal, but it's just so delicate, right? Like, I don't want to put any deep grooves that you're going to end up having to.
So after the forging is all done, I'll clean up the shape with a file and get everything kind of trued up. And then at that point, it's still not considered a blade. It's still just a piece of steel shaped like a blade. And so the critical moment when the blade is born is when it's hardened. And a Japanese sword has two different hardness zones in the blade. The edge will be very, very hard, which makes a good cutting edge, but is somewhat brittle. And then the rest of the blade will be a really tough type of steel. And it's not two pieces of steel, it's just two different steel crystals within the same blade, and that's caused by the process of hardening, which is unique to Japanese swords. And to do that, you coat the back of the blade with a thin layer of clay, and that acts as an insulation layer, so that when you plunge the hot steel into water, the edge cools really quickly, and the rest of it cools about half a second later. And that little difference is all it takes to give you the two different hardnesses. The only problem with it is it's a very stressful procedure on the steel. And so sometimes when you quench a blade, it'll crack, and that's it. After 10, 12 hours of work, it's lost. The whole project is back to square one.
So at this stage, if I overheat a spot, then it's undone all of that careful low temperature forging we've done. So that's why the temperature is so important at this stage, or one of the reasons.
Hours upon hours have been poured into this single piece, and the final heat treatment is at hand. Day's face is a mask of concentration. One false action could result in failure.
As a bladesmith, that's the moment when you either have a blade or you've done it all for nothing. So I would say that's the point where there's the most risk and stress, but it's also the point where there's the most joy, because if you succeed, you've got a blade, and the rest of it is safe sailing from there. For me, the steel is the heart of the whole project. So finding good steel is really important to me. And what I'm aiming for when I'm hunting for steel is to find something that's as close to Japanese tamahagane steel as I can find. And the main characteristics of it that I'm looking for is it's low alloy, so especially manganese. I don't want a lot of modern alloys, which means it needs to be more than 100 years old. So once it's hard, then the rest of the work is taking the blade to different stones and taking off the extra steel, cleaning it all up and polishing it. And if you use a Japanese polishing stone, a natural stone from Japan, it will actually show you those two different hardness layers as you polish, and you can see that line. Usually it's the wavy line on the samurai sword. That's brought out just by polishing with the right kind of stones.
Cool. Waiting for the water dance. Okay, a little hotter than I like, but let's see what it did on the stones here.
To me, because I'm working with a piece of steel that has a history already of being made 150 years ago, of being some tool or some part of, an old carriage for somebody on a farm for decades, and then for lying in the field for more decades, that story is really important to me, and I kind of want to honor that with what I do with the steel. But when you polish a piece of Japanese sword steel, you can still see the texture in it from the layers of the folding. And if you go back 150 years, you can still find pieces of steel in the West that were made in a similar way, that have layers. And when you polish them, you can see the grain of the steel, which is really neat to me. Another thing that I do for the mounting the blades is, as much as possible, I use reclaimed and local materials. So instead of importing the Japanese wood that's traditionally used for the sword, I found a local wood that's really similar as far as properties. So as a bladesmith, I'm aware that every time I pull the piece of steel out of the fire, every time I hammer it, every operation I do is potentially changing the character of that steel for good or for ill. So as I control the temperature and the way that I forge it and the way that I shape it, I'm actually contributing to the long history that that steel has, and hopefully turning it into something even better than it was. When I'm finishing a knife, I'll do the rough polish just to the point where the blade has its final geometry, and then I'll do all the woodwork, building the other metal fittings, and then the very last thing I do once the knife has been completely built is the final polish. And the final polishing takes almost as long as all the other polishing together, and it's just working with finger stones to bring out the temper line, the hamon, and show the grain of the steel. And that's kind of when the whole project comes together, and you finally get to see what was in the steel hiding all along, and see it with the rest of the components. So that's also a big moment. And for me, making something out of real materials is very rewarding, because when it's done, and someone can take care of that for longer than my lifetime.
History flows like molten metal. Archaic tools gather dust to the point of legend. But is this the end?
Well, between my wife and I, we're always forecasting where our pieces are going to go, to how big, how large, the texture, and even what type of new innovations we're going to come up with that are going to incorporate a lot of our pieces at shows now. And so far, we haven't been wrong, the direction that we've gone, and hey, all we can do is, like I said, the passion speaks for itself.
I would like the legacy of my work not to be that I produced a lot of stuff, but that each piece that I produced is a work of art unto itself, and something that someone would want to care for and pass to the next generation. So that's always kind of the framework for my work. Is this at a level where I'm happy with letting it go out into the world, and if not, I need to go back to the workbench and keep working on it.
Blacksmithing, ironworking, metal sculpting, all these ancient techniques are still alive and well in our world today. And sure, you may have to come to a park like Heritage Park to see it in action as it was in the old days. I think that as long as there's artisans innovating, creating, there's still a chance for us to see the soul of steel.